Thank you very much for coming here today. We have a great pleasure to introduce to the UI community Professor Christopher, who is going to speak about the challenges in education. But first, I would like to introduce to Raquel, who is going to present or introduce Christopher for you. So thank you. I would like to give a warm welcome to all of you. I hope we are going to learn a lot and we're going to enjoy the conference really. So please, Raquel.
Thank you. I'm one of the parents, my name is Raquel. I'm one of the parents involved in this beautiful project, which is the Pozzolatico Learning community, and also in the creation of this Liceo dei Colli, which is an innovative Liceo, upper school, and which is the original idea of this Liceo was to create. We're all the parents who have created this Liceo. We're all parents from the Waldorf school, and we wanted to offer our children the possibility to continue their studies in a Waldorf similar approach, because the Waldorf school doesn't complete the whole cycle. It stops at class 8, which is terza media. So we decided that we wanted at least to try to create something so that they could continue that path of education. And we didn't exactly know what, but in our search, we came across Mr. Christopher Clauder, who's a very experienced teacher, and who's also he's been researching into educational approaches, and he's been a Waldorf teacher for many years, and he's also been incorporating other approaches from emotional education and from creativity in education, and he has been leading us in this process of creation of this upper school. And the upper school has just started, has been opened on Monday, and whoever wants to visit it is welcome to come to one of our open days. We'll give out a list so that you can write down your emails, and you will be invited to visit it whenever you want. Thank you.
So, good evening. So I intend to speak for perhaps just under an hour, and then leave some time for questions and discussion, if we can do that. So, going back in time to 1989, which was an important year for European history, in that then, of course, it was when the Berlin Wall fell and East and West of Europe were united again. But it was also an important year for children, because it was in that year that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child was agreed and signed, and became legally binding on all the states who had signed it to follow. Not all the states of the world have done so, but nearly all, except 2. And this was a shift in mentality, because it changed the way, and will continue to change the way, we look at children. Because it moved us away from a view that was more about saving children, helping children, to a new model where children have rights. And that is beginning to have an impact on the way we run our schools. It certainly has an impact on the way the children or young people see themselves as rights bearers, no longer the object of adult attention only, but also subjects in their own right to be able to express themselves, to participate as a legal right. Now, of course, such a change doesn't just come about with a declaration. The world doesn't change like that. But the process is ongoing, and we can beginning now to see the results of that change in attitude, of a definition of what is a child? And of course these definitions have varied from age to age, from philosophical approach, from cultural mores, cultural ways of behavior. What is a child? But this is a new one, this legally binding document that entitles the children to be heard and to be respected. Added to that, there's a protocol. Added to that declaration, there's a protocol on how it is expected to be applied. And it's Article 29, protocol to Article 29. And I'd just like to read you a bit of that protocol from the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child. This article insists upon a holistic approach to education that reflects an appropriate balance between promoting the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional aspects of education. The overall objective is to maximize the child's ability and opportunity to participate fully and responsibly in a free society. It should be emphasized that the type of teaching that is focused primarily on accumulation of knowledge, promoting competition, and leading to an excessive burden of work on children may seriously hamper the harmonious development of the child to the fullest potential of his or her abilities and talents. In other words, the conventional form of education which we have inherited in our culture is not in tune with the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. Promoting competition, accumulation of knowledge, and excessive burden on work to compete actually can be detrimental to the well-being of children. And this is quite clearly stated in this protocol. And that a holistic approach is what is required if the children are to be able to exercise their rights, to be participants in our world. So it's a fundamental change, and it's a challenge, because it means changing what we call school. We can't now go back to school as we experienced it. Something is happening within what we call school, and tensions are building up from the young people themselves, because they are changing, regardless of whether it's the law or not. There's some fundamental shifts in child development over the last 100 years. And one shift, which is very dramatic, is the age of puberty. The age of puberty has changed very strongly. And I can just give you some of the figures for that. In 1860, the onset of puberty in girls was 16 years, 0.6, so 16 and a half. In 1920, it was 14 and a half years, the onset of puberty. In 1950, the average onset of puberty was just over 13 years, 13.1. In 1980, the onset of puberty on average was 12 and a half years. And in 2010, it had dropped to 10 and a half years. Yeah? So in that period of time, from 1860, when it was 16 and a half, it has now dropped to 10 and a half. So in other words, the age of puberty has decreased by 6 years since 1860. This is a massive change. And it's changing, it's changed since, yes? My last figure was 2010. And now the prognosis is this is accelerating. Every decade, the age of puberty declines by 4 or 5 months. In other words, children have less time to be children. They take on a physical maturity much, much earlier, with all that it brings, with sexual development, the ability to procreate, a change in feelings and emotions that brings, different concepts of relationships, which one goes through in puberty, but now occurring at the age of 10. Now surely, if we take our schools seriously, they have to respond. Something has to be done to accompany these children through this transitional period, which for all of us is, well, for most of us, is dramatic. There's a complete change in our perspective of ourselves, of the world, of our family, of our learning, and we all know what puberty brings with it, for good or ill. It's a tumultuous time in our lives we all go through. Now, this physical maturity does not necessarily also go with the brain maturity. The brain has its own rhythm. And the age of maturity of the brain still remains with the prefrontal cortex being fully developed at the age of 22, 23. So there's a divorce between the physical changes in the world of feeling and the world of emotions and how we control our emotions. Because until the prefrontal cortex is fully developed, we aren't really totally in control of ourselves. So these children are going through an unprecedented change that hasn't happened before in human history. Yeah? So there's a change there in attitude, yeah, emotionally, and we have to now confront that. And I was speaking of figures for girls, but it's very similar for boys. Not quite as dramatic, but very nearly so. The boys too go through this change. Yeah? And it's not just in the Western world. It's all over the world. Yeah, it's not just because of the Western lifestyle, with our consumer culture and our good food and our fortunate health services that we have now. It's not just that. It's a worldwide phenomena that puberty is coming earlier. So in a way, you could say the children, the young people are telling us something. That we have to respond to the questions they are asking through their change in physicality and in their emotions. And that's why I think me and the colleagues I work with around the world feel we must fundamentally question our whole education practice. It's based in the 19th century. It's based on factory education. It's based on mass education. But if it does no longer serve the real needs of the young people of today, and unless we as educators change our practices and change our view, they will become disaffected because what they learn becomes meaningless. But there are other changes that go alongside that. That's just a change in the physicality of the child. There's also the change in their future. We've seen now in the last 5 years with the recession that the jobs market has changed too. That what was once the possibility of going to school, then having vocational training or university, and getting a job and a career, and then your pension, that doesn't work anymore either. Young people have to be incredibly adaptable. They must have multiple abilities that they can go from one job to another very fast, or even do 2, 3 different tasks, multitasking, multi-jobs at the same time. I've just been in Pavia this morning with a young psychologist, a young woman, and she was speaking of that, how she has to be able to jump from one situation to another, one challenge to another, with no continuity. And she said, that's what we all experience now. But she said, many of my friends have no hope. They know there are no jobs for them. There is no place in the world for them. So how does that reflect when you're at school as a young person, knowing that there is no security, there may be no place for you? And the figures are astounding of joblessness with young people. Yeah. It's calculated in the OECD, the world's richest countries, have 26 million young people between 18 and 24, not in work, not in training, not in education. Yeah. The World Bank says in the developing world there are 260 million young people not in work, not in training, not in education. That means 300 million young people have no future. And we know what happens at that age if they are rejected by the world, if they can see no process for the future. The scarring the personal damage is very deep and can last a very long time. For a young person, they're full of ideals. They come with things they want to do, things they want to offer the world. And the world is saying, no, we don't want you. We don't want your contribution. We don't want you what you have to offer. So where does that leave our society? Where do they go? What do they do? And we've seen this indignados in Madrid, yes, this anger. And we can begin to see this become socially disruptive. A lot of the Arab Spring, so-called, was young people saying, we don't want life like this. Or in Istanbul, yes, the rebellion against the forces of tradition, young people saying, we don't want this world. But it comes very much because, in a way, they feel we don't want them. And again, this has implications, especially for secondary schools, because that consciousness percolates down from the 20-year-olds to the teenagers. What are they in the world for? And if there's no place for them to belong and to make a contribution to society. That's not the only change. The other change is technological. We live in a fast, rapid, technological world where it's, for people of our age, keeping up with the latest smartphone or the latest software or it's so fast. Yes, we have to admit, most of us, to be very ignorant about. We can perhaps use a smartphone if we're lucky, but the rest of the technological world, just the young person has a facility with that world. The interconnectedness of social networking has deep impact that I don't think we in this room actually understand or even know. But the impact of social networking, whether it's Facebook or whatever, how this influences the young person's lives, for good or for ill again. In England recently, there's been cases of young girls committing suicide because of cyberbullying. In other words, people posting negative comments about them on their Facebook site, on the wall, or in any way on the Facebook. And they feel powerless, and they can't speak to adults about it. And it's led to, I think, about the last few months, to 3 girls killing themselves at the age of 15, 16, because they just could not face this on their phone every day. And what creates this is being anonymous. That people posting these negative comments do not have to admit that they did it, because it's unsigned. There's no name attached. They just appear out of the ether in front of their faces, and then they despair and get desperate. That's perhaps the negative aspect of the technology, and of course it has very positive aspects too. But the negative aspect, of course, is that young people tend now to do less physical activity, on average. Their muscles are getting weaker. Again, there's been studies done in University of East Anglia in England that show that the muscle quality of many young people is decreasing. Whereas before they could hold on to horizontal bars and pull themselves up, fewer and fewer can actually do it. And a decrease within 10 years. Not all, of course, because some like to go canoeing or mountain climbing, of course. But on average, that ability is decreasing and obesity is increasing. Worse, of course, in the Anglo-Saxon countries, but even in Italy, with a healthy food culture and an awareness of food, even here, obesity is becoming a problem. Because screen time, and again, the figures are quite astounding. Here, for instance, at the age of 7, a child will have spent an entire year of 24 hours a day looking at the TV, computer, or video games. So it's 1/7 of their life. Yes, counting sleeping time too, in front of a screen. By the age of 18, a young person would have spent 3 whole years, 24 hours a day, watching a computer, video games, or a screen. It can damage their health. It can also help them learn. But it's a fact we have to take into account in our schools. And it's not just by producing computers in classrooms and using it there that we actually work with this. It needs a balance. Children then need more physical activity. They need to be come more in contact with the world around them in a direct way instead of just indirectly through the technology that we possess. So at the same time of this, there are mental health problems, increasingly so, in many countries. Again, a survey done recently, it came out, it would appear, it says, that around 25% of children and young people in the developed world have an identifiable mental health problem. 25%. Of whom 10% is qualified as a mental health disorder, which is, of course, much more serious. So 10%. And again, these figures are a bit difficult because who defines what is a mental health disorder or mental health problem? That can vary from culture to culture. And I believe in Italy, you've suddenly discovered you've got lots of ADHD children. But again, how you actually define that as a symptom varies from place to place. And this is a moving goals with these figures. But nevertheless, there is an increasing problem. And I found in Spain, for instance, this is exhibiting itself in classrooms with many teachers with aggression. Aggressive young people who will not accept the authority of an adult, who fight back when a way that teachers are powerless to control and deal with and give up. So this aggressive tendency is growing. Yeah. So that's a rather negative view. I think we should take that into account when we work as educators, whether as parents or in our school. I heard a comment from a parent just 2 days ago, a very astute and educationalist, psychologist actually, and she said, I got a shock. My daughter came home the other day and she said to me, Mother, you're trying to educate us for a world that has gone. Please educate us for the world that is here today. And of course it is like that. We have had our childhood, and our childhood experiences live in us. And almost subconsciously we assume a world that has gone, because it was our world where we lived in. But now we have to recognize when we work with young people, it is different. So where are we going? What are we going to do? Well, an interesting study has come out in the United States. It's forecasting what the world of education will be like in 2020. And of course, nobody really knows. We've no idea what's going to happen in 7 years. We don't, you think 7 years ago, but even before the recession, what a different world we lived in. So, and changes come even faster. But it's interesting to look at what they see here, and that should be taken into account. Things like the growth of cities. Yes, where we have huge metropolises of 50 million people in a city. I mean, we have now 20, 25 million, 30 million, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Lagos, Hong Kong. But they're talking about 52 and going up to 100 million people in a city community, especially, I think, probably around the Yellow River in China. You can see that emerging. A completely different way of life when children are brought up in this density of population with no access to the natural world to go out to play or whatever. I saw this in Hong Kong. It was shocking. That the children, little children of 4, are going to kindergarten and then studying 10 subjects a week as well. And their free time is spent in shopping malls, being carted around by their parents on Saturday morning. The intensity of their lives and the pressure on their lives is extraordinary. Again, we were fortunate not to experience that. But what does it do to a young child? And this speaks about this change in the technological business of our world. It calls them disruptive social innovation. It's disrupting our world. It's changing our society. Over the past decade, the most vibrant innovations in education are likely to take place outside the traditional institutions. These institutions face a critical dilemma: how to reconcile bottom-up developments in education with traditional top-down hierarchy that is currently in place. So we have our schools, our policy, our education minister, our Department of Education, the authorities, the inspectors, the head teacher, the heads of department, to the teacher, to the student. Hierarchical process that we've been living with for hundreds of years. But now something is happening from bottom up through the technology we've developed. Yes, the interconnectedness from the grassroots. And that's having a disruptive effect. And the hierarchies that we've traditionally developed don't work anymore, and will work less and less for the young people. And it goes on. An explosion of innovation has been transforming how we think about learning and how we organize talent and resources for learning experiences, and has effectively unbundled school as we knew it. So it's unbundled schools being unraveled. And of course we try to hold on to what we know. Normal human response. We feel we need security. We like security. We want our children to be secure. So we tend to hold on to institutions as they were, because we know where we are. We know what we're doing. We have a nice plan. We have a good curriculum. Yes, it's all organized. But the pressure builds up. Yeah, like steam. It builds up. And we won't be able to hold on much longer unless we respond in a new and innovative way to the way we work with young people and the children. And this is recognized across the world. This is said again and again and again. Whether it's the OECD, UNESCO, United Nations, World Health Organization, even the World Bank. They know on that level of INGOs, international non-government organizations, they know. They've been speaking about it for the last 10 years. But at national level, where main competences lies, it's very difficult to bring about change. Education is a conservative profession because we like to hold on and we want our children to be secure. Take the OECD, for instance. Here's from an OECD paper. Our way forward is to reinforce the socialization function of schools and to recognize more explicitly that they are communities in their own right. Such an emphasis doesn't conflict with strong focus on cognitive development, but it suggests an acknowledgement of a comprehensive set of educational outcomes going beyond measurable standards. In other words, this tendency of national governments across the world to measure, test more and more, OECD said that's not what it's about. We have to go beyond measurable standards. Of course we need knowledge. Of course we need information. But if we talk about real schooling and real education, we have to think much further than that. And schools are communities in their own right, and therefore should have the autonomy to change to meet the needs of the children and young people within them. Or this one's UNESCO. In 2007, they held a conference in Berlin, and they invited all people they felt were experts in education to come along and tell them what the future would be. And this is what they said. The educational institutions of the future need to dedicate themselves much more intensively to emotional and social capabilities and convey a more extensive value-oriented educational concept. I'll read it again. The educational institutions of the future need to dedicate themselves much more intensively to emotional and social capabilities and convey a more extensive value-oriented educational concept. Yeah. So the social, the emotional should be part of our schools. These new communities, we see schools. We cannot any longer say, this is just about information, this is just about academic or cognitive learning, and ignore the holistic view of what a human being is, whether a child or an adult. Our schools, what we call schools, or communities will have to absorb and work with the social emotional aspects of our lives and the children's lives as well, if they are to mean anything in the future. Again, OECD. What the children need to learn, integrated and usable knowledge, rather than sets of They need to learn integrated and usable knowledge, rather than sets of compartmentalized and decontextualized facts, emphasized by instruction. They need to be able to take responsibility for their own continual learning processes. So learning to learn. This is what's needed. That the young people become responsible for their own learning and don't just get presented with contextualized, compartmentalized, decontextualized knowledge, facts, figures, remember it, take your exam and forget it. That's not what the young people need. It's a social and emotional experience as well, which means we have to make fundamental changes. Now those are sort of INGO papers, but they're also educational thinkers who've said similar things. One I really admire was Piero Freire from Sao Paulo. He was Commissioner of Education in this big multi-million city with extremes of wealth and poverty next to each other. Just favelas with incredible poverty and crime and prostitution and violence next to splendor and richness. And of course it still is a very dangerous place because of that. But he wrote a book called The Education of the Oppressed. And one of his ideas, he got wonderful, a lot of fruitful ideas in there, was there are two sorts of schools. And he called one sort of school banking education. That's the traditional banking. You put information out and you put information in and you get a citizen out. Yeah, basically. You invest in knowledge and information. But he said that is really going against the dignity of a human being. The other sort of school, he said, was the problem-posing school. In other words, the school that creates problems. Because he said that's the way we learn. By creating a school that questions, doesn't have all the answers, like in banking education, they think they know the answers, and we know what's happened to banks in the last 5 years, yeah? But problem posing, that the school is there to create problems, questions, challenges, because that way we learn. And he said that really is for the dignity of the human being, because it tells us that we're all in the process of becoming. Being human is about becoming. We never are, we always become, because we learn every day. There's always something we didn't know. There's an experience we haven't had. And each of these experiences is a learning experience. Therefore, we're always becoming someone else than we were yesterday. And he said that is the dignity of being human. And we must acknowledge it in our children. We never are the perfect parent. We never are the perfect teacher or the perfect academic. We never are. If we think we are, of course we are not, because we've stopped asking questions. In asking questions, we evolve, we change. And that's why we need institutions that create problems. And to see the problems as an opportunity to learn, whether it's on a social, whether it's in relational, whether it's about knowledge or whatever, or practicalities, a place of learning. And that's what we're hoping to bring in some modest form with our Liceo de Colli and the learning community we're creating. That it's not going to be plain sailing with all the answers and a utopian, idealistic environment where everybody's happy every day. No. It's a challenging concept, and it'll challenge us all to do something better today or tomorrow than we did the day before. On many different levels. The idea, but the challenge is one, if you see it as a challenge, you can learn from it. So that's our concept. And I think it also brings in other forms of educational innovation. I think a great deed has been done in Reggio Emilia with Malaguzzi. I'm very surprised to hear that people tell me it's not so well known in Italy as it is in the world. Reggio Emilia is a magic word in the rest of the world. What he's done for early childhood, his concepts and what they're doing for early childhood has huge consequences. When they have conferences of Reggio Emilia, the rooms are full of young people who look after early years children, early education and care. And Malaguzzi had this wonderful concept of the rich child. You see, our educational system is based on a deficiency model. What the child can't do. Therefore, we have to enable it to do it. Yeah? That's the sort of teaching model of a deficiency model. It's looking what you can't do. Malaguzzi turned it round. He said, we have to look at what the child can do and build on that. Their sense of wonder, their artistic sensitivity, their trust in the world as children. Build on it. Not say they're not adults yet and they've got to learn what cynicism and abstract knowledge and analysis, but what they can do. Celebrate that and find it. And he has this lovely image of a funnel. He said, conventional education is like a funnel. We funnel things into a narrow little pipe. What's big in childhood, the wisdom of young children, this immense capacity to sense the world and to experience the world in this fresh, imaginative way. We pour it into a funnel, thinner and thinner and thinner, and then so they come out as what we want them at the end. He said, Malaguzzi, I hate funnels. We must widen it. And just as he did then with Reggio Emilia, I think we'd like to try, again, in a small way, with our Liceo, to look at what the young people bring us, not the child saving of the past, which I mentioned at the beginning, but respecting the young people from what they can bring and listening to them, listening to their insights, listening to how they feel, listening to their questions, so we learn with them. And it's not to say it's a sort of anarchist chaos. Of course, and every institution needs a structure. It needs a form. It needs people need to know where they stand. But it's possible to combine that with an evolutionary process of learning, yeah, which our whole bodies exemplify. We need skeletons in our body. We need the bones. We need the structure to be able to stand up and walk and move. But all the time, our bodies are continually transforming themselves. It's in which we don't sense, we don't see. But the enormous amount of fluids that are being pumped around our body, it's immense. We don't notice it, but it's there. There's a constant transformation in our bodies, but we need the structure to hold it together. And the same for a school. We do need to know, we start at 8:30 in the morning. We do need to know the teacher's going to be there and have at least some idea of what they're going to teach. Yeah? These things are needed, the preparation, the form. But within that, it's possible to create fluidity and listening and hearing and build a relationship with each other, whether as a group of colleagues, with parents, teachers, whatever we call them, and with the young people themselves. So this is going to be an interesting experiment. What will they bring us? Because we don't know. We don't know. We have to trust them. We trust them. And when you trust people, they respond differently. That quality of trust, which a little child has, until they're abused or whatever happens to them, a child out of its own nature trusts. Can we bring that back in an adult way? Conscious, aware that the world is unjust and unfair, and there is manipulation, and there is competition, and there is cruelty. Yes, of course, that is the real world as we know it. But if we can find that trust in each other, to look beyond the superficiality or the surfaces, then if we trust the young person, and it's a well-known educational fact, trusting the young person brings out the best in them. They can then feel responsible for what's happening. They act responsibly because they're trusted. Yeah? And it's the same in every classroom. When you teach children, you expect the best, not the worst. And expecting the best from a child enables them to do their best. better results. And again, this is very well known that what the teacher expects, if they expect their children to be good and do well, they more likely are. If you expect them to be bad and not to do well, that will help their failure as they go along. Right, so that was Mr. Malaguzzi. Right. Another interesting document appeared around just in 1996. And this was the commission by UNESCO to look at, again, what should schools do in the future. And it was called the Delors Commission, after the French commissioner, who was the head of the commission in Brussels at the time. And he produced this book. It's in Italian too. We've got it on our leaflet, the website, in Italian. And in English it's called Learning the Treasure Within. And they said in the future there are 4 pillars of education that we have to take into account. Learning to know. That's traditional. We need to know. We need to understand. We need the facts and the figures and to be able to use that knowledge in a wise way. Yeah. And to have a general knowledge. And we learn to learn. That's learning to know. And that's one of the greatest skills, I think, that what we can give our young people, that they learn to learn. That each subject has its discipline, its potential, its richness, but behind it all is that ability to learn, because that's what is going to last for a lifetime, not the subject itself. And the other one they brought up was learning to do. That you can deal with situations. You can deal with conflicts. You can work. That you can develop your work experiences and your social experiences within your local or national context and alternate study and work. That in your life you can go to work and you can continue to study. Again, very common. I was reading today about these new courses called MOOCs. You know, these online university courses that are being set up around the world. I mean, the number of people who follow these is enormous, whether it's from Harvard or Stanford and going to set up a British one and all the rest of it. These people want to learn. There's a thirst for learning, and that's part of this learning to do. The third pillar, they said, is learning to live together. That we understand each other and appreciate our interdependence, that we need each other across the world. We can no longer be independent entities as cities, as they were in the Middle Ages, or nations which developed in the early modern age. We can't live like that anymore. We need each other across the world. All the things we use, work with, they come from the globe somewhere. And then we need an understanding, an appreciation of our differences, the mosaic of human culture, all the different colors of a mosaic, but they make one pattern. And it's respecting the diversity and enjoying the difference, but also learning to appreciate and understand what those differences are. And they make life, of course, much richer. And it means respect, because by learning to live together, we may perhaps not enter back into the history of the 20th century with these catastrophes, 50 million people killed in the Second World War, for instance. I mean, the figures are incomprehensible of the number of people killed in the last century, whether it was a great leap forward in China or the First World War or in the revolutions or the Civil War. Enormous numbers of people. Surely, with what we know and understand about the human being, whether it's neurobiology or the learning sciences, we don't have to fall back into that catastrophe. And so learning to live together is a key skill, and it could be and should be part of experience in school. That the young people see the person next to me is not the same as me. They may not be as clever, but they're not less. They're not less because they don't pass examinations. Perhaps they've got a good heart. Perhaps they're not as greedy as I am. Perhaps they can do something for me on another level. And they learn that by being a class community. Of course there's tensions, misunderstandings, conflicts, but the way we teach, the way we work with the subject matter, can be a way where they actually learn to understand each other beyond just a competitive world, which, again, is not really sustainable if we look at the environment around us. And the last pillar is learning to be able to be autonomous, to be able to be responsible, to make your own decisions, to be able to create your life anew through resilience if you face challenges, yeah? To find your own potential, be helped to find your own potential. So those 4 pillars, and this is interesting, most governments say, oh yes, this is good, this is what we're going to do in the future, but they don't, they never do, because they say, oh, it's going to cost money. Of course it doesn't, it's not, it's an illusion, but it's transformatory. And it's all known. I mean, all ministers I've been in ministers of education's offices to speak to them. And there is on the bookshelf, there it is, the book, Learning the Treasure Within. And all these OECD books, they're there, and UNESCO books on their bookshelves as ministers of education. But where does it go from there? And so it's up to civil society to bring about these changes. If we want to bring about education change, we can no longer rely on the top-down way. We have to, as civil society, take responsibility for the education of our children, but not just our children, but all children. All children of the world have a right to good quality education. And some is being reached, the Millennium Goals. Yes, it's reduced the number of children without primary education from 150 million to, I think, now 70 million. Not in primary education. So it is possible in a few years to bring about change. But it needs the participation of civil society. People like us saying, yes, I'm responsible too for the education of the children of this world. And I'm not just leaving it to local authorities and government. And that leads to another lesson. And this is a lesson from Ontario in Canada, where they try to say, well, it's not just it's not testing that really improves education. What is it? And they then did lots of experiments with many, many schools and thousands of teachers, and I won't go into great detail now. But they discovered that the best way to improve education is collaboration. When teachers work together, that is the best stimulus to improve the quality of classroom practice. Teachers learning, peer learning between teachers, and peer learning between schools, even better. That has a profound effect on what happens. And so this collaborative element should be built into the school. And that's what we're also doing with the Liceo already. We're 3 days old, but with the teachers, we've developed a collaborative structure, which they've all agreed to and are practicing now, already. And that is what we call, it's not, in Italian, it means something different than English. We call it mentoring in English. But in Italian, I heard today, it's slightly more authoritarian. And it works like this. That each teacher chooses another teacher, and they go into each other's classroom. They just share. They go and they meet each other, and they look at each other, and they discuss their lessons with each other in confidence. Nothing goes out, nothing written down, no reports. But basically, the 2 teachers share. And it was lovely. Today they said, I'm with you, and I'm with you, and I'm with you. And this really gives a teacher a bit more structure, a bit more form, and helps them do better, having somebody in as a critical friend. Because you're their critical friend as well. It works both ways. So I've seen this working in some schools, and I think this is a very easy, bottom-up way of improving the quality of education. And all they have to do, every week when we meet, they have to say how many minutes they've spent with each other. That's their accountability. Whether it's 2 minutes or an hour, in the meeting they will just say, I was with my mentor, we spoke for so long. That's all that's needed. We don't need to say, what did you say and what happened? That's their business. And this Michael Fullan's work shows this collaborative element has deep impact. And we should then go further. As I said, this is a moment among the teaching profession, but I think we have to include everybody connected with the school with these sort of processes. And the last theme, creativity, become a buzzword. I met a man at our open day on Saturday, a man who said, I've just come back from Shanghai, and he said, everywhere I see the word creativity, creativity, creativity. Certainly I've seen it in Hong Kong and Singapore, in Asia, that this word is the future. And I'll quote you from the ex-Chinese Prime Minister, the Chinese Premier, Wen Yaibu. He's lost his job a few months ago, but he was Prime Minister, This is what he says. This is the Premier of China saying this. We must encourage students to think independently, freely express themselves, and get them to believe in themselves. Protect and stimulate their imagination and creativity. Well, that sounds fine. I don't know quite in how far that goes with the Communist Party in China. But nevertheless, they know, and I noticed it very strongly in Singapore, that creativity is the key to the future. An uncreative society is a society that's doomed. Innovation, creativity, new ideas are becoming very, very important. And if we have uncreative societies, then they will collapse, because the competitive element in the world is so strong towards creativity. But it's not only economically that creativity is important. And I've just come across a book from Australia. And this is about a program called The Song Room, which I visited when I was there. And it's wonderful. It's just simple. Again, these things are not rocket science. And they don't need lots of money. They're very simple. And in the Song Room, they got young people who were musicians and artists and put them in a school for 6 months. They're not trained teachers. They have 2 weeks preparation, and they're given a job for 6 months in a school and said, be yourself with the big children. So they were artists with the children. They played music, they did dance, they did painting, without having to worry about any tests, no examinations, just doing their art for 1 hour a week. And this book that's come out by Professor Caldwell looks at the results, and they're astounding. That children following this for a year or two, in primary schools this is, have jumped a year in academic ability in 3 years, just by putting the arts seriously in the curriculum. With these 24-year-old, 25-year-old artists who still have this youthful optimism and enthusiasm and joy. And I've been in these lessons. I've been in one particular school where there were migrant children, all migrant children, children that had ended up in Melbourne and were not wanted by society, were excluded. They're foreigners, they're immigrants. And if you've noticed today what the Australian government is doing to immigrants, I mean, it's criminal that they're going to be sent back to Indonesia or sent back to Papua New Guinea. Horrible. So these people entering Australia on the boats, refugees, they are children who can't stand in a circle because they don't know how. They can only stand in straight lines because that's how they got their food in refugee camps. Yeah? So these are children that are damaged. And I was in a lesson with a young woman cellist, played the cello. And the joy these children had. And these are the children that he studied. And what happens? They come to school much more frequently. They enjoy school. There's a better ethos. And they are academically more able because something has changed in them just through 1 hour a week of art. The same in Spain. I've been part of a project called Responsible Education. We've done the same in Spanish state schools. Put in 1 hour a week of art. And done at the University of Santander of Cantabria has done a study over 3 years. Same results. And Professor Caldwell, has looked at results like this all across the world. That putting these arts in, music, dance, theatre, painting, sculpture, cooking, woodwork, whatever, fashion, arts, it has a huge impact on children. And so there's enough there to keep us going. Now these ideas I've expounded this evening are what we're trying to do in our new school. Wouldn't call it quite an experiment, but it is different. I mean, it is based on solid research. The work I've been doing in Spain for the last 6 years on social emotional education, the work that Howard Gardner has done on multiple intelligences 20 years ago, the work of Goldman and Salovey and Meyer on emotional intelligence in Yale. We have a lot of this experience now around the world. Catterell, with his work on the President's Commission in the United States on the arts, we're accumulating all this knowledge and trying to incorporate it in our Liceo. Also with the Waldorf-Steiner principles, because they too have that same image as I've been describing in different words, but the same sort of principles behind their work. But what we want to do is to make it very contemporary, that it's really meaningful for the young people of today when they're with us and in the classroom or in a school activity. I'd like to finish with a poem, which of course is difficult, and I'll read it twice, yeah? Because it's not always easy. No, before I tell you the poem, I'll tell you a story, then a poem, okay? What sort of people do we need in our world? And one example I like referring to is Gandhi. Gandhi was in South Africa and he had to get on a train in a great hurry. And he jumped onto the train and his sandal fell under the train on the rails. What did he do? He took his other sandal off and threw it to join the sandal that had fallen. That's creativity with an ethical element. One sandal is no use to him. One sandal is no use to anybody else. So he threw the other sandal. And that's the moment. It's that unexpected, it's the ability to be spontaneous, to live in the moment, to see the situation, sum it up, and do it. And that's the sort of people we need. And that's what it also means to be a teacher when you're in a classroom and somebody asks you a difficult question. In America, they have scripted teaching. Okay? The lesson you buy. And it says you say this, and you say this. Then it says at the end, permitted questions from the children. And it says, if the children ask a question that's not here, do not answer it. This is the mechanistic world we live in. And that's growing. People want, as I said, they like to be secure. And the teachers then are worried that they won't get high marks in the examinations. And of course, they're paid by results. So they follow this script. How dehumanizing that is. And it may sound funny to us, but it's growing and it's being pushed. Publishers love it. It sells educational books. Yeah? And it helps academics make educational measurements much easier. Yeah? It's quantifiable. That's the way the world is going. And we have to stand against that. And Gandhi, with this moment of inspiration, is not scripted. You have to expect the unexpected. And that's what real teaching is about. The question that comes, you never expected. Then what you do? You can say, no, we'll wait till the next lesson, I'll think about this. And that's bad, because the young person thinks, oh, what sort of person is this? Yeah, because when an adolescent asks a question, it's actually saying, who are you? Who are you? You're standing in front of me, telling me things, but actually, who are you? And if you know that that's what's really happening with an adolescent, why they are rebellious, the rebelliousness of youth is a question. What does it mean to be an adult? How do you respond as an adult? If I'm going to be an adult, am I going to be like you? And so when they ask a question, you have to completely change and just be yourself. Be honest, be authentic. Then you earn their respect. But as soon as you say, I'm the teacher, do what you're told, not part of the lesson, you lose it. You lose their respect. So it's that moment of spontaneity, and that's creativity. Creativity is all about risk, of going into territory you don't know. You step into it. And as you make the colors or the tones or the movements, it changes what you do. It evolves. And that gives life. That gives life to us as individuals. It gives life to our school. So I think the best research, one of the best researchers in the world are poets. Poetry. We have to bring back poetry into education. And the poets show us how. Because in a poem, you have words that mean things. One word means one thing, another word means another thing. You put them together, they mean something else. It's the same word, but they have a relationship in a poem, and it has a structure. It has a form, but within that, the relationships are transformed. The meaning is not what they were when they're standing by themselves. Yeah? And the rhythm and the rhyme and the form helps emphasize that creative element. And it's by Thomas Tranströmer, Swedish. He won the Nobel Prize. Yeah, and the Swedes were delighted. And he's a very deep poem. I'll read it to you. I'll say a few words and I'll read it again, because it's very difficult to understand poetry in a foreign language, or even in your own sometimes. But in a foreign language, it's not that easy. So I'll read it and then come back to it. Inside the huge Romanesque church, the tourists jostled in the half-darkness. Vault gaped behind vault. No complete view. A few candle flames flickered. An angel with no face embraced me and whispered through my whole body, "Don't be ashamed of being human. Be proud. Inside you, vault opens behind vault endlessly. You will never be complete. That's how it's meant to be." Blind with tears, I was pushed out onto the sun-seething piazza, together with Mr. and Mrs. Jones, Mr. Tanaka, and Signora Sabatini. And inside each of them, vault opened behind vault endlessly. So the image is going into this Romanesque church with these wonderful vaulted shapes, these arches, endless arches that go on and on and on. And I visited some in Pavia this morning. Lovely. This quality of this particular architecture that has secret spaces, and you don't discover them unless you walk. In a Romanesque church, you can't stand and see it all. It's not like a basilica from early Christian centuries. Romanesque churches are made you have to walk, and you discover a new space. So he goes and then he's jostled by tourists, crowded people pushing, and it's not very comfortable. He goes into this church with all the tourists. And then he sees these spaces, one for another after another. And then this angel, with no face, saying this, "Don't be ashamed of being human. Be proud. Inside you, vault gapes beyond vault endlessly." So the spaces out there in the church are the spaces within. We're never complete. There's always a new space to find. And that's what learning is about. Finding that new space within as well as without. And then he's just shocked. He gets tears in his eyes, discovering that the environment he's in is a reflection of himself. He didn't build the church, of course, but what he sees there is human. It's what it means to be human, that there's always a new discovery, a new space inside. And then he goes out and the sun, bright sun, Italian piazza, and then he looks at the other tourists. And then he sees the ones that were there pushing him, whether they're Japanese, Mr. Tanaka, or if they're English, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, or whether they're Signora Sabatini. They too have spaces within. They have infinite capacity to change and develop. Yeah? And there's a wonderful, what do you say, an episode that just changes the way we see the world. And I think this is very key to education, to what we do or try to do in our schools, that finding new capacities, new competencies, new imagination, new creativity, innovation in ourselves, and bringing it into the world where we also find it in others. And being awake to that moment, and that's what the young people today are looking for. That we can feel that we're authentic, that we stand there as explorers of the world. We don't know it all. We're not just teachers or just parents. We are explorers of the world. So I read it once more, and then I finish. Inside the huge Romanesque church, the tourists jostled in the half-darkness. Vault gaped behind vault. No complete view. A few candle flames flickered. An angel with no face embraced me and whispered through my whole body, "Don't be ashamed of being human. Be proud. Inside you, vault opens behind vault endlessly. You will never be complete. That's how it's meant to be." Blind with tears, I was pushed out onto the sun-seething piazza, together with Mr. and Mrs. Jones, Mr. Tanaka, and Signora Sabatini. And inside each of them, vault opened behind vault endlessly. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for this stimulating analysis of the challenge of education. So I will open the floor. So please introduce yourself before pose the question. Thank you very much. And use the microphone, please.
I would like to know, what is the relationship between this new school and Rudolf Steiner's philosophy?
I was working it out today, about 40 years working in Steiner schools. I founded a school in Holland. I taught in special needs schools. I was a teacher in Steiner schools. I've looked after the Steiner schools in Europe on a European level for 20 years. I've done Steiner teacher training, lectured in it, given advice, all sorts of things. I think it's a basic. The principles of Steiner education are about common humanity and the spiritual quality that we all carry. But there is a tendency in Steiner schools to become a bit enclosed, to see the world as hostile, to reject when people come towards them with enthusiasm or ideas. Say, "Oh, no, we have to stick to something." And again, it happens all the time. If you think of the monasteries of the Middle Ages, the same, this sort of sense of enclosure, of possession, that we have knowledge and other people don't. And that's why there were so many reforms, a new monastic order, Carthusians or the Cistercians or whatever, Augustinians, always that change. And every community has that tendency. Now, my job for the last 20 years for the Steiner movement has been to work in the world. Well, that's how I defined my job. Not everybody liked it, but never mind. And to work with educationalists of all types, because we all have a common thread. We all have goodwill for children, regardless what we call ourselves. And so although we are related very closely and want a good relationship with the Federation, with the Steiner School that's already here, for our young people we want to open up more. And one reason is, of course, is that Steiner secondary schools have huge problems. I've just been to Sweden and Norway, and they're closing their secondary schools all over Sweden and Norway. Sweden and Norway used to be excellent Steiner countries because the view of the child in Steiner was just the same as in the culture, the respect for children. Now they're having no more high schools because the children, young people, won't stay. They go to a different place where they think it's much more related to the modern world. So there's a school in Oslo called Oslo B, which rethought all Steiner education from 16 upwards. It has hundreds and hundreds of students, 50% Steiner, 50% not. And it's just growing. It's just growing because the young people find there's something that means something to them. So although we are inspired by Waldorf pedagogy and the teachings and the experience, 90 years of experience, we use that to develop our curriculum. I'm part of an international forum from one person from all countries all over the world. We work together on developing Steiner education, so we feel responsible for its development, but at the same time, we want to contemporize it and see what that teaches us and how we again can take that back into the Steiner movement, that other high schools could see this as a different way of doing it. And as I said, taking into account other great educators, Janusz Korczak, Paulo Freire, Howard Gardner, bringing that in, not saying they're foreign, because it wasn't Rudolf Steiner, but saying this is part of a common human knowledge and wealth we all share. Yeah?
Christopher, my question, your statistics on pubertà, you say, yes, puberty, are statistics that come from the Occidental world, from the developed world, more or less, no? But I remember in Black Elk Speaks that at a certain moment he says, when we were living, following the power of the circle, our children were becoming men much sooner. Now that we are in square boxes and we live then, they take much more time to become men, to become grown-ups. So this has something to do with the word changement, change. In the Iliad, and on Homerus' poem, there are more or less 24,000 repetitions. And the repetition is very essential for creativity. So when you speak about change, and there is a research that we must do for ourselves and for our children on which are the things that we must repeat and to refine, to be able to be creative. Because when all the environment changes all the time and we have no full stops point, like a bit in America that every generation they change home I don't know how many times, it's very difficult to be really creative. So you have all these suburbs of all these cities around the world that are practically equal because everyone wants to be absolutely creative without respecting any tradition, any transmission, you see. So that's these two questions.
You're quite right about the repetition. The repetition is a very important pedagogical tool. It's a process of learning, and it's, as you said, a sort of process of security. And in the Waldorf methodology, there is this repetitive element. But it's not a prison. It's not a prison. It's not a box in which you stay. It enables you to feel secure and reach out. You need your feet on the ground to reach out into the world. And it's very important that children have that sense. They also have to know what's coming. So you, one of the practices in Steiner schools is you tell the children what's going to happen tomorrow. So there's a sense of security. And every Monday will be like every other Monday. And every year will have its festival at a certain time. So there is the repetition of nature. The natural world has its repetition, so does a human being. But within that shouldn't preclude the creativity. But it's when it becomes a box that it becomes dangerous. But the circular quality of repetitiveness is a way we learn. We have to do it when we learn languages, when we learn maths. Certain subjects need that, but as a circle, not as a box.
A problem of aggressiveness which is increasing in our schools, in our public school, also in the private schools. Children are becoming more aggressive against the teachers as well, not just the adults, but because it is the authority of teacher they want to recognize. So do you think that the Waldorf school and the pedagogy of Steiner could help in a way to build a community where teachers and parents and students as well can work together for a better future?
Certainly studies, one done a couple of years ago by Bo Dahlin of Karlstad University in Sweden, looked at outcomes. And it did find that comparatively with state schools, there was far less aggression, that Steiner pupils had a much more tolerant attitude to life after they left school, and were much more unlikely to join extremist political groups. And also that they were, because this interest in other people that they'd experienced. And this also comes through direct teaching method, that the teacher doesn't have a textbook that says we're going to page 92 today, but actually has to stand there, absorb the subject, and face the young people and children and develop a relationship with them. And the children too have to have the confidence to express what they've learned on the stage. All these aspects of Steiner do help create a community sense. There are arguments, there are frictions, of course, and schools have dissolve or collapse. But if we look at the outcomes of the students themselves, they are far more able to deal with these sort of challenges and less likely to turn to aggressive. And this is measurable. Those are measurable factors. And Bodalin and others have been working on that. And also in Germany, there's academic results that show that. And it's all on the internet. Yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful speech. It was really fascinating listening to you. I'm Annika Zorn. I'm working here at the UI, and I'm engaged in adult education. And I found your speech particularly interesting because so many things can in fact be also transferred one-to-one to the adult world, to ourselves. So what I'm doing is to work in this lifelong learning program. So this is the European vision, as you probably know, to emphasize that in fact we cannot leave school, we cannot leave university and then say, okay, we have now all the knowledge gathered, we need to come to the end of our life. But what we are actually doing is to enjoy learning, and we must also continue to learn. And I think this is then also a duty, an obligation for schools to give the tools to children to be able, what you said, to learning to learn. And this today means, in fact, to be able to use technology, because what you mentioned with the MOOC, with the massive open online courses, more and more in adult education, there is the form of blended learning. So you have classroom teaching, which is combined with the webinars, with the tools where people have to be able to build their own knowledge. I heard once in a lecture, it was called rhizomatic learning. So you have kind of roots, plants coming out everywhere, and you find your way through this jungle of knowledge yourself. And I think it's really important to teach children to read. That's why I like you mentioned that we need also in the school to also use technology. It's not only an enemy, but it's really, if you teach children to use it properly, they can, through Google, through something, they can find answers to their questions if they use it properly. And then the other thing, what is interesting in this adult learning world is that they have a lot of peer learning, so that there's not anymore the role, there's the teacher, there's the student, there's the instructor, there's the student, but in fact, peers are becoming instructors of the other peers, and they even said, I read an article of a neuroscientist some time ago. I mean, IQ is not a good indicator of what perhaps we want in our children, but there it was said that there is a difference in the IQ between single children. So single children are not as intelligent in IQ as older brothers or sisters, and they assume that the reason is because as an older brother or sister you're teaching your younger brothers and sisters, you enable yourself to have more knowledge, to know more. It's really fascinating, and that's what actually they are doing now in this adult teaching world, to let peers to teach each other. So the barriers are completely dissolving, and I think it's also something which we all, as parents or as teachers, we have to accept that. In fact, sometimes perhaps the children in the classroom are perhaps the better teachers to their other peers. Thank you.
Yes, I would agree, because teaching is a learning profession. And I think, and it's the joy of actually learning from the students. I still remember my experiences in the classroom when I learned something from the people I was so-called teaching. And we are going to face this challenge as well, because Pozzolatico is not just the Liceo. We're working with many other organizations together. And what we're trying to create is a learning community where institutions and organizations learn from each other. And then once we've got this founded, this Liceo, hopefully next year, we'll start on courses. And again, using blended learning. People need a direct experience. It's not just enough on the internet. So they need to meet, to discuss, to have coffee together, share a common experience, but at the same time use the technology. And we're going to try and do that for teaching development within Waldorf education, but many other spheres in the whole Pozzolatico enterprise. But again, this is new territory. And we have to do that. We have to break down barriers. You know, learning to learn means with ourselves as well as with others. So that will be our next challenge once the Liceo is thriving.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Javier. I am a researcher in this institution. Now that she brought the topic of university studies, and while I was listening to your exposition, I was thinking also about university. And as I see, university studies have changed. And when I studied in Argentina, and the object there was to learn somewhat. I studied law, and in going to the classes, I would have to learn the civil code, the administrative code, and to repeat this knowledge to prove that I knew the topic. Something different, I think it occurs in America or in other institutions. And the idea there, as I understand it, is to produce knowledge. You are required to produce a document, a paper. No? And the idea is that you rebuild something and you give your opinion on a topic. I think that this idea is imposing itself through code, and every university institution tries to copy this model. I'm just curious about your opinion on this, and if you could develop.
Yeah, I know there's a huge pressure to publish in the university world and to raise up on the league tables, whether you're in the Shanghai Index or wherever. This is a tremendous pressure. The result of the work I've been doing in Spain in researching social emotional education across the world, 21 countries at the moment, is there is no recipe. Just there is no recipe. It has to come from within the individual or within the community. Each school has to find its own way. You can't take from one and put it and say, I'm going to do exactly the same. We can learn from each other. We can see what others have done and share the experience. But what we do has to be in the context of who we are. And that means the individuals in the institution, whether university or kindergarten. It depends on who they are that should create the form. And I think that's what I speak about, this greater autonomy, that in a way the institution should be allowed to find their own path. They'll make mistakes, but that's how we learn. But that each university, just like a school, should have an individuality, because it's a school or a university is actually basically at its root a network of relationships. That's what our educational institution is. It's a network of relationships, which means that everybody who comes in or everybody who goes out changes it. And so it's being prepared to live with that quality of evolution. We talk about evolution and we think of dinosaurs or gorillas, but we forget we are constantly evolving too, biologically, as a species and individually. And a healthy institution is one that's able to evolve in its environment, learn from its environment, other universities, other schools, what's going on, and yet find its own path. And this has been very much key in the thinking we've done on social emotional education. So what we've done in our published works is given examples. This school did this place did that, this is what this one looks like, this was this experience. Many, many case studies within the theory to inspire people to find their own path. It's difficult with such a complex organization as a university, of course. Not so easy. Easier in a kindergarten. But still, I think that is the key, really. And to be prepared to have the courage to do it, the courage to step into something unknown and give your own institution its own unique character that isn't like the others, but learns from others. But easier said than done.
I wasn't very clear. My concern is, again, as I perceive it, the model now is that university should produce knowledge, no? That not only I think in university, also in schools, you know, you produce a paper, and the idea is that you enter to university and you don't learn but produce. The idea of a university, again, is to produce knowledge. Do you have an opinion on this, on whether this should be the aim of every educative institution?
No, I wouldn't. I think what knowledge of what? There's so many aspects of human knowledge that is part of just everyday life. We develop knowledge. It doesn't have to be in academic papers or refereed journals. I think the purpose of a university is a process of people learning together. Basically very simple. Whether they're students together or students and tutors or tutors together, a university should have that universal aspect of learning together and not producing knowledge as a commodity which you can then to sell and rank yourself because you produce more knowledge than someone else. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I think we have to close the event. So, if there is no, oh, there is another question. Oh yes, please. Last question.
My name is Costanza Loni. I would like to ask you a question about children concentration. I was talking to a teacher of children between the age between 6 and 10, what we call elementary school in Italy. And I asked her, she has been teaching for 40 years, what changes she has noticed in children. And she told me that she finds that children are, extremely intelligent, very stimulated, compare obviously to her memories, but there is an enormous change in concentration. There is a great lack of concentration. It's very difficult for them to have a small goal, like to draw what we call cornici, around the paper with some colors, some small things they have to do. It's very difficult for them to keep concentrated on their object. I would like to ask you if you have any detailed research data about this problem. Is it something that you have noticed?
There is research in this area, and concentration spans have diminished among children. They live in a flickering world. And it's well known with publicity and programs. You have to, when they make television programs, they know they have to change it very fast to keep the children watching, especially if they want to sell things. Yeah, fast. So the children are used to it, and they expect a teacher to do the same. So it really then depends on your skill of teaching, how you develop the concentration. Now I know in Anglo-Saxon countries, they're now developing a technique called mindfulness. So mindfulness teaching as a subject, where the children learn to be still for longer than they used to, where they learn to ponder and think about things. And they actually have to be taught this, because they don't do it naturally anymore. They're not bored anymore. Boredom is important sometimes. You don't know what to do, so you dream. Because the children are pressurized, they have to learn so many things, they're taken from this and that and the other. My parents often feel guilty because they have to work to earn a living and they haven't got time for their children. So children are rushed through their childhood, and that affects their attention span. So the art of teaching is, in a way, making teaching something of a theatrical experience, in a way. The way you modulate your voice, the way you move, the tempo of the lesson, where you speed it up and slow it down. You can learn it as an artistic skill to keep the children fascinated and inspired. So there are ways of accommodating it, but you're quite right, it is a huge problem. Children just all over the place, more and more, because of the world we're bringing them up in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this stimulating and fascinating talk. So just a clap for Professor.